The blueprint promised that removing the command structure would paralyze the target state. What it actually removed was the only authority capable of negotiating a surrender. In modern military planning, the concept of the decapitation strike is treated as a master key. The logic is clinical: identify the leadership, target the communications, and sever the head from the body. It is the defining doctrine of current operations targeting heavily fortified adversaries, most notably the Iranian government. Planners calculate that overwhelming air power and precision strikes can trigger a systemic collapse. They want to avoid the political, economic, and logistical nightmare of a massive ground invasion. They want a sterile war. It is a doctrine built on the assumption that a state is a fragile, top-heavy machine. Pull the right lever, break the main gear, and the whole apparatus grinds to a halt. But history suggests something entirely different. A nation is not a mechanical clock. It is a biological organism. When the central nervous system is attacked, the extremities do not always shut down. Often, they become autonomous. To understand why this strategy fails, we have to understand why we fell in love with it in the first place. The theory of strategic paralysis through air power gained immense prominence in the late 20th century, championed by theorists like John Warden. He viewed an enemy nation as a series of concentric rings. At the center of these rings sits the leadership, the brain. Destroy the center, the theory argued, and the outer rings, the military, the infrastructure, the population, would simply cease to function. It was an elegant, seductive solution to the ugly problem of attrition warfare. It promised swift victories. It promised minimal casualties for the attacker. And it promised a mathematically precise end to conflict. You don't need to fight 1 million soldiers in the mud if you can vaporize the 5 guys giving them orders from the sky. But a dangerous hubris began to take root. We confused the ability to see a target with the ability to control a country. We assumed that because technology had evolved, the fundamental nature of political power had evolved with it. It hasn't. Political power is still territorial. It is still about who controls the street corner. Let's look at what happens when the theory meets the ground. Consider the 2003 invasion of Iraq. The entire campaign began with a targeted strike on Dora Farms, a compound where the Iraqi leadership was believed to be sleeping. The goal was quite literally to end the war on night 1. The strike failed to eliminate Saddam Hussein, but even as the subsequent shock and awe campaign successfully dismantled the communications infrastructure of the state, it revealed a catastrophic flaw in the decapitation theory. By destroying the Central Command's ability to talk to its field units, the attackers did not necessarily force those units to capitulate. How do you surrender if you can't reach your commander to ask for permission? Instead, local commanders cut off from their hierarchy, isolated and panicked, took their massive stockpiles of weapons, abandoned their easily targeted bases, and dispersed into the cities. The decapitation strike succeeded in destroying the formal, conventional military structure. But in doing so, it accidentally organized the foundations of a decentralized insurgency. Airpower broke the government, but it could not replace it. It raises a question that American commanders would wrestle with for the next decade. Long after the formal shooting stopped, when you destroy a state as monopoly on violence from the air, who inherits the pieces on the ground? A decapitation strike does not erase the enemy's combat power. It shatters it into 1,000 localized fragments. The head may be gone, but the body continues to thrash. This reliance on standoff firepower has repeatedly demonstrated its limits against even non-state actors. In 2006, Israeli military doctrine heavily favored air power to neutralize Hezbollah in Lebanon. The assumption was exactly the same. Precision strikes on leadership nodes, rocket launchers, and infrastructure would force a collapse of the organization's will and capacity to fight. The air campaign was devastatingly precise. Billions of dollars of infrastructure were erased, yet it failed to achieve its strategic objectives. Why? Because the leadership simply decentralized. Hezbollah anticipated the air campaign. Local cells were pre-supplied with ammunition and rockets. They operated entirely independently of the severed command structure. Without a significant ground force to physically occupy the terrain, clear the deep bunkers, and hold the launch sites, the air campaign could only harass the enemy. It could not defeat them. The strategy of decapitation fundamentally misunderstands how dedicated ideological systems absorb shock. When they lose their head, they don't die, they mutate. Which brings us to the modern geopolitical powder keg. The current strategy targeting the Iranian government faces a magnified, terrifying version of this historical reality. Iran is not Iraq in 2003. It is a vast, mountainous country of over 80 million people, featuring a deeply entrenched, multi-layered security apparatus. More importantly, Iran's military architecture was specifically designed over decades to survive decapitation. They watched what happened to Saddam. They watched what happened in Lebanon. And they adapted. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps operates on a doctrine known as Mosaic Defense. It is engineered redundancy. Command and control networks are buried deep underground in reinforced facilities. If the central authority in Tehran is vaporized tomorrow, regional commanders already possess the authority, the arsenals, and the logistical independence to continue operations. Let me be clear, air power is exceptional at breaking things. It can vaporize command bunkers. It can crater runways. It can sever fiber optic cables and impose catastrophic friction on an enemy's ability to coordinate a national air defense. But what air power cannot do is hold a street corner. An F-35 cannot enforce a curfew. A cruise missile cannot secure vast, abandoned weapon depots. A drone cannot manage a civilian population reeling from the collapse of essential services, water, and power. When a regime is shattered from the sky without a massive, occupying ground force ready to immediately replace it, the result is rarely a stable transition of power. It is a vacuum. And military history dictates that vacuums are filled by whoever has the rifles and the willingness to use them. To stabilize a nation the size of Iran requires hundreds of thousands of infantrymen, logistical battalions, military police, and civil affairs units. Without them, a collapsed government does not mean the end of a war. It means the beginning of a dozen smaller, uncontrollable wars. The architects of air campaigns hope for a sudden, silent capitulation. But the historical record shows that when you bomb a state into a failed state, you do not solve the security problem. You merely change its shape. Regimes fall when their systems collapse, not when their leaders disappear. And the quiet contradiction remains unresolved. The desire for decisive, low-cost solutions continues to shape military planning, while the reality of political complexity continues to undermine it. In war, removing the head does not always stop the body. Sometimes it just teaches the body how to survive without one. If these are the kinds of decisions you want examined, this channel exists for that purpose. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next briefing.